Stoughton Media Access Corporation is pleased to present International Forum, a new cable show of interest, periodically interviewing foreign newsmakers, bringing them from across the ocean directly to your living room. Here's your host for this week's show, Wayne Pomiansky.
Hello and welcome to International Forum. Delighted to be here today, and I think it's very fortuitous in that we schedule today's program hoping that we would be taping about the time of President Obama's trip to Israel. And sure enough, as we tape on Thursday, March 21st, we're actually developing our program on the second day of President Obama's visit to the state of Israel. We are very fortunate in that our guest today is Yoram Ettinger. Yoram has been on our program before. He is, by virtue of education and experience, an expert for us to be discussing the visit to Israel. He is a former Israeli minister for congressional affairs at Israel's embassy in Washington, D.C., where he served with the rank of ambassador. Ambassador Ettinger has served as Israel's Consul General in Houston and as Director of Israel's Government Press Office. Currently, he consults to members of Israel's cabinet and Knesset and regularly briefs U.S. legislators and their staffs on Israel's contribution to vital U.S. interests, on the root causes of international terrorism, and on other issues of bilateral concern. Ambassador Ettinger is certainly no stranger to the United States. He travels frequently to the U.S. and, of course, back to Israel. Educationally, he did his graduate studies at UCLA and undergraduate at the University of Texas, El Paso. He is the editor of Straight from the Jerusalem Cloakroom and Boardroom, newsletters on issues of national security and overseas investments in Israel's high-tech industry, as well as the Ettinger Report. His expertise spans U.S.-Israel relations, Middle East politics, demography and population fluxes and fallacies in the Middle East, as well as overseas investments in Israel's high-tech arena. Ambassador Ettinger has had, needless to say, a very busy 2 days with President Obama's visit to Israel, and we thank him very much for taking an hour out of his busy schedule to bring us up to date on goings on in Israel. So, Ambassador Ettinger, welcome to International Forum. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
We, of course, are following very, very closely here in the United States the president's visit to Israel. A lot of the imagery that we're seeing on the national talk programs and news programs show what appears to be a very cordial, friendly relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama. We see multiple images of them smiling, shaking hands, hugging, laughing, joking to one another. There was one image that I saw in the news today with Bibi Netanyahu's two sons in attendance, and the president was joking about how handsome they are, and Mr. Netanyahu responded by saying, the president's children are also beautiful, and it seems to be putting to flight this notion of the president and the prime minister, having a rather icy relationship. So, what do you think, Yoram? Has that relationship warmed in recent days?
Well, it looks like it. However, we have to be very, very realistic and cautious about rushing into any conclusion, because so far it's only about talking the talk, which is cheap and easy. The test will be when it will come to walking the walk, and then we'll see whether there is consistency between the walk and the talk. So far, there is no doubt that the visit has been very, very different than prior meetings between the two of them in Washington. And most importantly, the president's own rhetoric has reflected a substantial, significant change from the rhetoric of the 2009 visit to the Middle East and the rhetoric of the last four years. In 2009, the president came to the Middle East, spoke in Cairo, and he spoke about the march of democracy in the Arab world. Later on, he spoke about the Facebook revolution and the youth revolution, and about the Arab Spring. It seems to me that the president has realized that none of that has anything to do or had anything to do with reality, and I think he has come to reckon with the fact that it's a stormy, boiling, seismic Arab winter and not Arab Spring, that there is no march of democracy, but rather an arena of tyranny, despotic regime, terrorism, intolerance towards one another when it comes to Muslims against Muslims, which suggests how intolerant they would be towards the so-called infidel Jew if they have a chance to express their intolerance. In 2009, the president came and referred to the Palestinian issue as the epicenter of Middle East turbulence, Middle East developments, Arab policy making, and at least so far, his reference to the Palestinian issue has highlighted the issue as a second or third or fourth priority as far as the president is concerned, by far overshadowed by Iran, by the events in Syria, by overall concern for the fate of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, by the concern about Islamic terrorism. Namely, there is an assessment here in Israel that the president is much more realistic today than 4 or 3 or 2 or 1 year ago when it comes to assessing the Middle East.
I think I would tend to agree with you, and I guess if I reflect back on 2009, I think here in the United States there was, I guess we could say now maybe some misguided optimism from the Arab Spring, the notion that freedom and democracy was breaking out all over. And of course, in the months and years that have intervened, we now see that maybe the optimism that we were feeling then is perhaps less justified as we see the more recent events in the Middle East. One of the things that really caught my eye, again, looking at some of the images coming out of Israel, were comments that Prime Minister Netanyahu made in which, he was saying that the U.S. and Israel seem to have the same time frame in terms of a 1-year lead time to Iran actually having what it needs to create a nuclear weapon. In the past, it seemed that Prime Minister Netanyahu thought the time frame was a lot faster than the U.S., and I wonder whether you feel that Israelis share that time frame with the Prime Minister. What are your thoughts in that regard?
Well, what the Prime Minister said was that when it comes to acquiring a weapon, nuclear weapon, indeed it could take up to a year. But when it comes to the most critical development, namely enrichment, that is what Israel is mostly concerned. We're talking about months rather than a year, and this is definitely a distinction. There's a divide here between Israel, which pays more attention to enrichment, while the president of the U.S. pays more attention to weaponizing, to actually acquiring nuclear weapon. There is a divide, I believe, between the president, who still deludes himself that diplomacy is an option, that economic sanctions are an option, while the prime minister's, my own determination has been that economic sanctions and diplomacy inherently cannot be effective, and that the only effective way of preventing a nuclear Iran is surgical military preemption in a disproportional manner with no boots on the ground. Unfortunately, the president still sticks to the notion of economic sanctions. He even refers to them as effective economic sanctions, while in fact they cannot be effective. To be effective, you must have the cooperation or collaboration of Russia and China and India and Japan, which you simply will not get, you do not get, and for all the wrong reasons. But that's part of reality. And in order to get effective sanctions, you must have universal, solid cooperation, which is simply an impossibility, and therefore there is no such thing as effective sanctions. The only thing that sanctions do is they provide Iran with more time to enrich the uranium.
What about the president's statement, which seemed quite unequivocal? Yesterday, I believe, he said, when he was appearing jointly side by side with Bibi Netanyahu, when he said the United States will not permit Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I would think that assurance would put to rest some of the concerns that the Israelis have about whether America, whether the U.S. Stands squarely behind Israel.
Well, not really, because the U.S. say the same thing about North Korea, and guess what? We have a nuclear North Korea. The U.S. again deluded itself that the economic sanctions would do the trick, failing to note that there are regimes in the world. Probably most of the world is made up of such regimes who don't care that much about the well-being of their citizens, and they care much more about their own military power, accumulation of power of destruction, especially nuclear. We have had certain experience with global guarantees, with U.S. guarantees, and on more than one occasion, when it came down to the moment of truth, somehow those guarantees were not as solid as they did sound when they were enunciated. The fact is, by the way, that American Arab allies at this stage are not certain about the merit of U.S. guarantees. In my assessment, the real reason why the president is here in the Middle East is due to the erosion of the U.S. posture of deterrence. The Saudis especially, but also the Jordanians, the Kuwaitis, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Bahrain, etc., dread a nuclear Iran. They realize that nuclear Iran would be their demise, and they do doubt U.S. determination to use the military muscle against Iran. And that, in my mind, is the real top reason for the president's visit. And unfortunately, there is a certain merit to the Saudi and Jordanian concern. They saw a U.S. ally, Mubarak, being let down by the U.S., basically thrown to the Muslim Brotherhood mob. They are reminded that the Shah of Iran was left hanging high and dry by the U.S., which then those days facilitated the rise of Khomeini, stabbing the back of the Shah of Iran, who was the #1 ally of the U.S. And certainly they remember that in 2009, when the Iranian opposition attempted to topple the regime, once again, they were left high and dry by the U.S., in particular, Western world in general, and therefore we're talking about talk, rhetoric. It's time for the U.S. to stop talking the talk and get into the real business of walking the walk. In my mind, knowing our neighbors in the Middle East, the only reassurance for the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Kuwaitis, the Omanis, and the other pro-U.S. Arabs, the only reassurance would be actual action, namely surgical, disproportional, military preemption against Iran, no boots on the ground. Anything short of that would not only fail to quiet down the concern, anything short of that would only fuel such a concern.
Let's talk a little bit about the president's trip to the West Bank. Again, the imagery we're seeing here in the U.S. is President Obama standing next to Mahmoud Abbas, representing the Palestinian Authority. The imagery seemed a little more stilted, maybe a little more formal than the president with Bibi Netanyahu. But there was the president in Ramallah on the West Bank, again espousing support for the so-called two-state solution. What are your impressions of that part of the president's trip?
Well, as of now, and I'm very careful, as of now, I don't know what will happen tomorrow and what will be during the rest of the visit to other Middle Eastern countries. But as of now, there's no doubt that unlike the very warm, friendly atmosphere between the president and the prime minister, the president and our president, the president and the public at large, we witnessed very cold atmosphere at the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority. And it seems to me that there is a chance, it's still to be proven, but there is a chance that the president concluded the proper lessons from his prior visit to 2009, when he extended a huge hand to the Muslims at large, to the Palestinians in particular, and rather than shaking the hand, he was bitten by the Muslims and by Palestinians. The president did go out of his way to signal to Palestinians that they constitute a top priority. He pressured Israel in an unprecedented manner, unfortunately coercing the Israeli government to freeze constructions in Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank for 10 months. And in return, he received no negotiation by the Palestinians and much more radicalized Palestinian position. So maybe he became more acquainted with the Middle East, where any gesture, tragically, is being interpreted as sign of weakness, and any forthcoming policy, any magnanimity is only a prelude to further demands and much more radical posture by the Palestinians. One element which was very resoundingly missing from the president's visit to Ramallah, to the Palestinian headquarters, was really the key issue. The president, unfortunately, completely ignored the major obstacle to any peace prospect in the Middle East, and that is hate education. Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, is the architect of the education system of the Palestinians, which he established in 1994 when he was deputy of then Yasser Arafat. This education system has persisted until today. It's hate education towards Jews, hate education towards the Jewish state, hate education towards the USA. It is part of the school textbooks, the curriculum, kindergarten through 12th grade. It's part of the weekly sermons in the mosques on Friday. It's part of the state-controlled Palestinian media, and this is responsible for the brainwashing of Palestinian minds. It is the manufacturing line of terrorists in general, of homicide bombers in particular. And I think that it's very unfortunate that the president of the U.S., which is the role model of free education, of free society, would not make hate education his top prime issue, because there is no such thing as peace process when there is hate education. Hate education and peace process constitute an oxymoron.
That it raises the question of what is the president saying more or less behind the scenes, when the cameras are not turned on, when he's meeting one-on-one with someone like Mahmoud Abbas, or meeting one-on-one with Prime Minister Netanyahu, whether he is, in the case of Abbas, pushing back, trying to extract some agreements from him as you cite, to change the hate education that, as you say, tends to brainwash the Palestinian youth and just continue to stir up resistance to any sort of peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I know yesterday, and again we're taping on Thursday, March 21st, yesterday he went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum. I've been there myself, and I think the exhibit of the Nazi propaganda about the Jews in Europe reminds one that propaganda, of course, creates imagery that is very detrimental to the Israeli people, the Jewish people, and one wonders what the president might be saying behind closed doors to Mahmoud Abbas in terms of trying to get the Palestinians to take a more affirmative or positive position. My sense is you don't feel that's happening at all.
Well, would the American president, or would any House member or senator or governor pay a visit to a hate educator in any of the 50 states? Obviously, the president would not dare do such a thing. Why? Why would the U.S. president pay a visit to a hate educator? Wouldn't it behoove a U.S. president to precondition a visit. In fact, to precondition any contact whatsoever, direct or indirect, upon the uprooting of hate education, and rather than shake the hand of a hate educator, to serve a message that the chief executive of the U.S. does not shake hands of hate educators. I think this is a very moderate, this is very progressive attitude, and once again, refraining from doing that serves the wrong signal. It sends a message to the Palestinians: not only do you get away with hate education, in fact, you are being rewarded, because we heard the president saying that he will try and increase financial support to the Palestinians. And let's be very honest about it. This is the financial support which funds hate education. And the question is that consistent with American values? It is not.
It reminds me of one of your posts earlier this year where you talked about the dangers of what you characterized as benevolent ethnocentrism. And I think the notion or the concern that you expressed was that Western countries, in particular the United States, feel that non-democratic societies have, an interest in responding to diplomatic and economic incentives. And your feeling was that they really do not, that in fact they favor conflict, confrontation, war, fanaticism, and oppression. And it seems like the concern that you express about the hate education would be an example of the naivety of some of the Western governments regarding this issue of benevolent ethnocentrism. Would you agree?
I think this is not the case of benevolent ethnocentrism, which has to do with well-intentioned naivete. I think when it comes to ignoring hate education, we're talking about reckless cynicism. More or less, what do you want us to do? Wait 20 years until they rid themselves of hate education? How can we wait 5 years? How can we wait 20 years? And wouldn't it take that long to uproot hate education from the Palestinian, from the Egyptian, from the Saudi and other societies? My contention is that hate education is the source of all malaise. That which we tell our children reflects most authentically who we are. That which Mahmoud Abbas educates his children reflects who he is, much more than what he tells CNN or Fox or ABC or MSNBC or President Obama. And once again, there's no doubt that ignoring hate education sends a very, very counterproductive, self-destruct message. Namely, you can keep on brainwashing your population, and don't worry, we will fund it. And this has been the reality since '94 under all American presidents, Republicans and Democratic alike.
So here we are. You're speaking to us. It's about 7 p.m. in Jerusalem. On Thursday, I believe the president is enjoying a dinner meeting with a number of prominent Israelis tonight. Looking at these past 2 days, are you more optimistic about the relationship between the U.S. and Israel than you may have been before the president's visit? Are you about the same, or pessimistic going forward?
Well, I've always been optimistic about U.S.-Israel relations, especially because of the very, very unique nature, being based on very solid Judeo-Christian foundations which go back to the arrival of the Mayflower and to the founding fathers and everything since then. And on top of this solid, unique foundation of shared values, we have had in recent years the very important element of mutual threats and joint interest. And that means that the relationship basically emanate from the bottom up and not from the leaders down to the people. As far as the President Obama's visit, so far I'm cautiously very, very optimistic about the positive change in President Obama's attitude towards Israel, but I'm cautious about it because so far it's only in the realm of rhetoric. However, Mr. Obama spoke about it when he met the Palestinians as well as when he met Israelis, referring to Israel's unique high-tech capabilities and Israel's unique telecommunications and other technological capabilities. That is a reflection of the new role played by Israel, which is part of the two-way street between the U.S. and Israel. It's no more one-way street, U.S. gives and Israel receives. It has been for the last 20, 30 years, and especially the last 5, 6 years, very busy two-way street, both give and both receive, and increasingly the role of Israel is positively intensified when it comes to bolstering the U.S. defense industry, when it comes to bolstering the U.S. commercial industry, certainly when it comes to bolstering U.S. national security. The President met with our defense minister, and the opening sentence was very, very telling when he says, good luck to whatever you do, he said to the Israeli defense minister, because whatever you do, he said, is important to the national security of the U.S. as well as Israel. And I think this is a very, very important message because sometimes it's lost even to friends of Israel in the U.S. that what Israel does in the Middle East serves America's national security, advances America's economy, America's high-tech, America's research and development, as well as Israel. Israel is not a recipient of foreign aid. Foreign aid is misnomer. The U.S. invests in Israel and receives the highest rate of return it gets on any investment. In fact, no private investor gets such a high return on his investment. And the best evidence was upon landing at the international airport here in Israel, Ben Gurion Airport, when the president visited the site of the Iron Dome, which is the Israeli-developed technology system in defense against mid-range missiles. This is a revolutionary system which will be co-manufactured by the U.S. and Israel, fully developed by Israel, development fully financed by Israel, but the manufacturing has been so far 1/3 undertaken by the U.S., which is very, very much appreciated by Israel. But the real bonus to the U.S. is forthcoming. India and Taiwan and Japan and the Czech Republic and South Korea and Poland intend to acquire this system. This will provide thousands and thousands of jobs to the American defense industry, complement of the most battle-tested laboratory in the world, otherwise known as Israel. We have done the same thing to thousands of American military systems. which has enhanced Israeli national security as well as American national security, as well as Americans' infrastructure of employment, research and development, and exports. And I think the president's visit has highlighted that angle as well. And let's face it, you don't get it from the Palestinians, you don't get it from the Egyptians, from the Saudis, from the Omanis, from the Jordanians. There's only one country in the Middle East where you get such a huge return on your investment, and that is Israel. And I would say that you don't have any similar ally in the world. We are the only unconditional ally of America anywhere in the world, but we are not only unconditional, and not only are we democratic, and not only are we reliable, but we are very capable, both commercially as well as militarily, on behalf of very vital American interests.
I think it was very interesting to see the president visiting one of the Iron Dome anti-missile batteries, and Americans are learning more and more about Iron Dome, how effective it is. I know there were, I think this morning, a couple of rockets that were fired from Gaza into southern Israel. It appears that there was some property damage, but no injuries, no loss of life. And as I understand it, one of the capabilities of Iron Dome is software that permits the systems to do in microseconds a determination of what the threat is from the individual rockets, and to knock down the ones that pose an imminent danger to parts of Israel where there can be loss of life or injury. One of the areas of your expertise, of course, is the economy. It appears that, like the U.S., the Israeli economy is improving and strengthening. There is a very, very strong tie between the United States and high technology companies that are based here and have enclaves in Israel. Do you see that continuing to grow this year and in the future?
Well, absolutely. By the day, the relationship between the American and the Israeli high-tech communities is becoming more and more intense and more mutually beneficial. By the day, we have an increasing number of American high-tech companies establishing themselves in Israel in order to leverage the Israeli know-how, the very unique high-tech technological scientific manpower here in Israel. By the day, we have more mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures between American and Israeli high-tech companies. And obviously, we are the junior partner. The U.S. is the senior partner. But the added value of Israel is that out of necessity and out of very, very excellent educational research infrastructure, we have been able to develop cutting-edge, game-changing type of technologies, which are very, very consistent with the requirements of American giants, and that has enabled the American high-tech companies to survive the international competition, to basically lead the international market, and I expect such relationship to further and further expand. The best evidence is that the leading venture capital funds in the U.S., which specialize in high-tech, are very busy in Israel. There's hardly a month without few investments by such venture capital funds, whether you're talking about Sequoia, Benchmark, Axel, Greylock, which some say that they can walk on water when it comes to very wise investment, and they have decided to focus on Israel. We have the examples of Eric Schmidt, the active chairman of Google, who has decided to invest privately in Israel, and he is a frequent visitor in Israel, not only expanding Google's presence in Israel, but most importantly, expanding his own private investments in Israel. And only recently, Facebook announced that out of the 10 most popular Facebook internet games, 5, or out of the top 20, 10 games were developed in Israel. And when you examine your laptop, you'll see that the vast majority of Intel gadgets, Intel microprocessors, and other very vital elements in our laptops are actually developed in Israel. Microsoft CEO said the other day that by the day, Microsoft is becoming more and more an Israeli company because of the impact of Microsoft's 2 research and development centers in Israel upon the substance of Microsoft products. So I foresee a very rosy future for U.S. and Israel, and there's no doubt in my mind that U.S. and Israel cooperation is going to produce plenty of cutting-edge technologies, which will be translated into new manufacturing lines, which will boost the economies of both the U.S. and Israel.
Well, let's hope that the Israeli economy and the U.S. economy continue to grow and create the technologies that we need, not only for security, but for other aspects of life in Israel and life in the United States. Going back to the political sphere, of course, President Obama politically has to grapple with a sometimes difficult U.S. House of Representatives where the Republicans hold a majority. There were elections, of course, in Israel in January, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, although he won re-election, did not have the same majority in Israel and has to, I guess, deal with a coalition. So there seems to be some political similarities between our government and the Israeli government and the leaders, Netanyahu and Obama. You had commented in one of your posts earlier this year that you really thought it was necessary to completely overhaul the Israeli political system. Do you still feel that way? And what would the ideal situation look like if it were overhauled?
Well, absolutely. The Israeli political system is dysfunctional. It's self-destruct. Just to give you an idea, 34 parties ran during the campaign. 12 parties have managed to be represented in the legislature in Israel, which is one house, 120 members representing 12 parties. How more or how less controllable can any legislature be when the largest party out of 120 has 31 members? Moreover, under the Israeli system is completely different than the American system, and the very sad commentary is that while the American system is based to an extent on Jewish foundations going back to the Old Testament, going back to the Exodus from Egypt and the separation of powers between Moses and Aaron and Joshua and the presidents of the tribes and the elders, etc., the Israeli system is completely foreign to the Bible, to the Exodus, etc. I long for the day when, just like in the U.S., legislators would dread the battle cry, "We shall remember in November." This is a battle cry which reflects the power of the constituent and the accountability, especially by members of the House as well as senators, to the electorate in their district or in their state. We don't have such accountability in Israel because people elect parties. They don't elect individual members. Certainly, I long for the checks and balances, which I know are annoying, especially to the president in the U.S., but checks and balances prevent or preclude dictatorship by the executive or by the legislature, and it's much more important to prevent dictatorship than to ease the process of legislation and formulation of policy. And last and not least, I believe that it's very, very important for Israel to have genuine separation of powers which exist in the U.S. does not exist in Israel. In Israel, the most powerful legislator is the chief executive, because in Israel, it is the those are the members of the legislature which comprise the members of the executive. Where is separation of powers in this case? So certainly, I do hope that changes will take place, and I don't know which one will take more time to achieve: peace between Arabs and Israel or dramatic changes of our political system. Both are, unfortunately, very, very long shot.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. It seems to me that we'll have to be very patient to see any of those changes developed. You had also observed that you thought the presence of Arab Israelis in voting in Israel was relatively low. And I found that surprising as well, because I would think that the Arab Israelis would want to seize the opportunity to try to influence Israeli politics and public policy. Yet the turnout not as high as one would expect.
Well, the interesting phenomena when it comes to the Arab electorate in Israel is that when it comes to national election, they vote in relatively low numbers. Those would be very, very high turnout numbers in the U.S. But in Israel, around 50-54% is considered to be very, very low. Jews have lowered their turnout, but it is above 60%, which is very low in Israeli recent history. However, when it comes to local elections, Arabs turnout amounts to 90% of the Arab electorate. Namely, they are very concerned about their domestic issues, and they are not. They do not trust the Arab parties when it comes to national election. Unfortunately, Arab parties have been controlled by very radical anti-Israel Arab elements. They pay much more attention to the Arab-Israeli conflict. They pay much more attention to the Palestinian Authority praising Palestinian terrorists than they do to the enhancement of the welfare of Arabs in Israel. And therefore, we have seen a relatively low turnout by Arabs and an increasing number of Arabs who vote for non-Arab parties. Increasingly, they have more faith in so-called Jewish parties than they do in Arab parties.
Yoram, we have a little less than 10 minutes. Um, let's take a little bit of time to talk about Syria. I know the president, while in Israel, mentioned that he was concerned about these reports of the Assad regime possibly using chemical weapons against the so-called insurgents. He mentioned that if it turns out that that is true, or if there's an increase in that type of weaponry, he described it as a game changer. I know there's concern about, should the United States intervene or shouldn't it? If the U.S. Brings weapons, more impactful weapons into Syria for the insurgents to use, might those weapons end up in the hands of influences that are contrary to the interests of the United States? Let's take a little bit of time toward the end of our interview to get your perceptions about Syria and the threat that situation poses toward Israel.
Well, it seems to me that Syria, along with the prospect of nuclear Iran, have been the major reason for President Obama's visit to the Middle East. The president increasingly realizes that the lava coming out or erupting out of the Arab Street in Syria is threatening Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Kuwait, and possibly Saudi Arabia. He realizes that he cannot ignore the growing doubts in the minds of Arab allies of America about the U.S. Capabilities or U.S. intent to use military power in order to stem the radical lava from spreading throughout the Middle East. Therefore, I believe the visit and therefore the interest in Syria, but just as is the case with Iran, the real test for the U.S. is not to talk the right talk, but to walk the right walk. And until there is a proper walk, there will not be, in my mind, restoration of the U.S. posture of deterrence, which is the backbone of the national security of Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Gulf states. Without determined USA, without the U.S. power projection, without the U.S. posture of deterrence, no pro-U.S. Arab regime feels secure, and their sense of the last 4 years is that there is a lessening of an American effective military posture throughout the world, and they are desperate for very clear signal that the U.S. once again believes in its own military exceptionalism, that the U.S. is not going to subordinate its own unilateral independence of national security action to a multilateral type of consensus, which unfortunately was the message coming out of the White House during the first term of Obama. Hopefully, this trip to the Middle East signals a departure from the last 4 years into a much more assertive U.S. national security profile in the Middle East and beyond. I am not certain about it. I am concerned about it, but there are certainly certain optimistic developments, but there are also some pessimistic developments, such as the appointment of John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, and John Brennan to 3 critical positions: Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, CIA chief. Those are 3 multilateralists. Those are 3 members of the very tiny club of pro-Assad folks in Washington. Until the eruption of the civil war in Syria, they were very clear supporters of the Assad regime, claiming that Assad Sr., Assad Jr. where actually constructive leaders, peaceful leaders, etc. I'm very concerned about the implications of their appointments, about the U.S. global profile, and mostly I'm concerned about this gullible idea that withdrawing from hotspots in the world would distance the U.S. from the wrath of terrorism, while the reality is exactly the opposite. And one, again, should learn from the world of football. The closer you are to the end zone of your opponent, the closer you are to scoring a touchdown. However, the closer you withdraw to your own end zone, the closer your opponent is to score a touchdown against you. It applies to football. It applies also to war on terrorism.
Well, as always, the international stage is fascinating and scary and optimistic, I guess, depending on which pieces of data one looks at. I think here in the United States, and I know from your recent post about a number of the surveys that have been done, Americans tend to favor more so close relations between the U.S. and Israel. There are certainly some Americans who feel the opposite way, but it seems like on balance, Americans want close ties with the state of Israel. In the time we have left, to maybe wrap up on a lighter note, here in Massachusetts, we've had a series of snowstorms. There's about a foot of snow outside our TV studio. So I must ask you there in Jerusalem, what's your weather like? Send some of that good weather this way.
Well, I don't want to hurt you, but right now it's getting cooler, and it's down to mid-60s, 60 degrees. During the day, it's 70 to 80 degrees. President Obama landed in Israel, and at the airport already, he took off his coat, and even then he perspired. We're talking about very, very nice spring, and anybody who wants to enjoy a nice spring in Jerusalem, a nice spring in the footsteps of Jesus, or in the cradle of Jewish and Christian history, you're welcome to come to Israel and enjoy very nice sunny weather and a very friendly atmosphere.
Well, I'm looking forward to my next trip to Israel, and although I am reminded on my first couple of days in Jerusalem, there was snow there as well, but it didn't last very long, and it certainly turned sunny and warm, and we could certainly use some of that weather here in the U.S. Yoram, again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us and share your perspectives on the President's visit and conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We have been having a dialogue today with former Israeli Minister of Congressional Affairs at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C., Yoram Ettinger. As always, a lively and interesting conversation. We look forward to many future conversations on our International Forum program. We hope that the remaining time in the President's visit will be worthwhile. And again, thank you, Ambassador, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
This is Roy Cohen, producer and director of the International Forum Show. Thank you for watching, and we welcome your comments to our email address, international.forum@yahoo.com.